I really did believe that I was never, ever going to be able to rejoin, life.
If you ask Georgie Dent when her nervous breakdown began, she'll have to really think about it. Was it at 19 when she found herself diagnosed with a disease she'd never heard of? Or was it a few months later when she was diagnosed with a different disease? Was it at 24 when, by all accounts, her life was pretty perfect? She was working as a lawyer at a prestigious firm in Sydney and living with her then boyfriend and now husband, Nick, who was studying medicine. Or was it all of those things combined? But really, it doesn't matter when her nervous breakdown began because it happened. At the age of 24, Georgie Dent's life fell absolutely, utterly and inexplicably apart. And she found herself in a psychiatric hospital for weeks. From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter, candid conversations with fascinating people like Georgie Dent. The first time I heard about Georgie's nervous breakdown was actually via an email from her that landed in my inbox, would have been about 10 years ago. Mamma Mia wasn't anything more than me just then, or maybe there was one other person working with me. And Georgie, who'd been a reader of Mamma Mia, reached out to me by email and wanted to share what had happened to her. She wanted to tell her story. She was a beautiful writer, I could see that straight away, and I published her story anonymously because she wasn't ready to share it with the world connected to her identity. And we both watched, kind of gobsmacked in a way, as hundreds of comments flooded in. Because contrary to what she had thought or maybe feared, Georgie absolutely wasn't alone in the way she'd felt at the time of her breakdown and then in its aftermath. Since that time, I've had the opportunity to get a lot closer to Georgie Dent. She worked here at Mamma Mia for a while, in between daughters number 2 and 3. And I've watched her become a mum, and then a mum again, and a mum again. I've watched her also become the most amazing journalist. She's a commentator on a lot of programs you might have seen on ABC News and The Drum. And now she's written a book. It's called Breaking Badly. It's a memoir about her nervous breakdown and what happened afterwards. And she joins me now to talk about it. George, when you were 19, you weren't really doing the average teenage thing, were you? What was going on with your health?
When I was 19, I'd finished my first year of uni and I had horrendous abdominal pain, horrendous, sort of like knitting needles in my stomach all the time. My stomach did not behave how tummies are meant to behave. And after sort of putting up with it for a long enough time, I went to the GP and sort of said what was happening. And she said, look, I would say the first point of call is probably a referral to a gynaecologist because a lot of the pain was quite pelvic, sort of in position. And so I went and saw a gynaecologist. And it's funny, when I started writing this book, the editor that I was working with said to me, if you could pick a point in time where you think your nervous breakdown sort of started, try and think about when that would be. And when she first said that, I thought, oh my goodness, well, how on earth would I pick that? And then suddenly it kind of came to me because I remember it so vividly being in this gynecologist's office, and he was a perfectly beige doctor. There was absolutely nothing untoward about him, but it was the most confronting medical appointment of my life at that point. So he basically took a history, me sitting opposite him, and I explained the pain that I had, and he said, look, my instinct is I think you've potentially got endometriosis. And I'd never heard of endometriosis at that point. And
can you explain what endometriosis is?
Yeah, so it's basically where endometrial tissue grows where it's not supposed to. So endometrial tissue ideally only lines your uterus, basically. But endometriosis is basically where it grows in the wrong spots, and it can cause incredible pain. It can cause fertility problems. It's very common. But at this point in time, for 19-year-old me, I found all of this very shocking and very scary, and I certainly wasn't thinking that I wanted to be having kids anytime in the immediate future. But I definitely knew at some point that was something I wanted to be an option, and this felt very much like that was going to be threatened. And so we had this sort of conversation, him sitting at the desk, me sitting opposite him, and he said, I'll take you into the little examination room and I'll do an internal examination to see whether we can see any signs of endometriosis. But most likely I think we'll probably have to do some operations to get rid of it. And I was thinking, right, okay. And then having that internal examination, and it was this horrendous bit of equipment. I mean, it was huge and it was cold, and I was in this tiny room with this man with this wand inside me.
Oh, yeah.
Sort of
it's
pointing
like the
out
giant
on,
sex toy that on a, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, this was a long
It's not
time ago.
sexy, though.
I was 19 and I'm 36 now. So, it's a long time ago. I imagine the medical equipment's probably improved. But we were in his tiny room and he was kind of pointing
An
onto
internal
this screen.
ultrasound, yeah.
Yeah. And he was saying, look, I think what we can see here, there's this kind of thickening. Can you see that? And I was like, I can't see anything. Honestly, I have no idea what that is. And I also kind of don't want to know what it is. But he said to me, I think what we'll do is we'll do 3 operations in the next sort of 5 weeks. We'll do 1 operation, go in and have a look. Then the second operation, we'll cut everything away. And then in the third operation, we'll go back in and just make sure there's no adhesions. And I was really, really scared, but I didn't want to give him that impression. And that sort of goes to probably more of my own personality and disposition, that I didn't want to be difficult. But I certainly remember holding it together for that appointment and then going outside and finding my little car and hopping into my car and just sobbing because I was terrified. And
You also felt like you were broken, right?
yeah, I did. I did feel broken. And part of the reason that I felt broken was because I'd been having this pain and this horrendously upset tummy for probably about a year and a half. And it wasn't easy and it wasn't fun. And I was I really did want to pretend it wasn't happening because, again, I was young and it's not really the done thing at uni to be talking about your digestive health problems and to be having this sort of excruciating pain. It just wasn't an easy topic of conversation.
No, it's when people are sort of drinking and partying and...
Yeah. And also this was before the internet was a big thing. So I didn't even have that sort of place to turn to, I suppose, in the way that now I think if a 19-year-old was diagnosed with something like that, there'd definitely be more information potentially accessible for her.
There would be Facebook groups. There would be a million other women's stories. There would be so much information to access.
Yeah, and there wasn't. And so I found it really terrifying. And I remember just sobbing and sobbing, and then eventually I called my mum and said what had happened. And her and Dad live in a small town in northern New South Wales, so about 2.5 hours from Brisbane. And obviously, well, not obviously, but I'm very fortunate. They're very supportive. And, as soon as I told Mum what was happening, she said, absolutely no question, Dad and I will come up, we'll support you, we'll help you around the operations. You don't need to worry about that. And so I was very well taken care of, but the operations themselves were horrific. And in hindsight, later when I ended up seeing another gynaecologist in Sydney, he sort of said to me, that is just barbaric. There is no way you would do 3 operations into the same wounds in a 5-week period on a 19-year-old. You just wouldn't do that. So at the follow-up appointment following the 3rd procedure, so I'd had it all done by now, and I was in a pretty bad way, I would say, by this stage. And he
Still in pain?
Still in pain, and also just really weak because I'd had these general anaesthetics. I also didn't go into these procedures with amazing health because I also had whatever problems were going on which weren't resolved by these procedures. And I just was feeling pretty shattered. And he said to me, Georgie, I think we should be honest, you don't look like you'd survive a round in a boxing ring. And I, at that point, thought that he maybe had me mistaken just for a really brief moment. I was like, does he think I'm a boxer? And I sort of looked at him and he goes, I mean, what I'm saying is some people would bounce back faster or better. And I was so fragile at that point that I really actually took that to heart, and I didn't. My mum was with me for that appointment and she was furious afterwards, and I was sort of like, well, Mum, he sees people all the time, and if he says I'm not bouncing back better, then obviously there's something wrong with me. And that certainly didn't help my internal messaging system that I already had going on, which was that I was somehow flawed in function because of whatever was going wrong, but also that I was not quite as strong as other people, and maybe if I was stronger I wouldn't be so debilitated by these procedures, or maybe I wouldn't even have these problems in the first place. It's not particularly rational, and it's not at all compassionate.
But that was your inner monologue.
Yes, it was. And then after I had those surgeries, about 6 weeks later, it was clear that my abdomen was still having horrendous problems. And so I went back to the GP and she said, well, I think you probably need to see a gastroenterologist now. And I saw a gastroenterologist and they did another really fun procedure to diagnose me with Crohn's disease.
And what's Crohn's disease?
So it's an autoimmune disease it's an inflammatory bowel disease, and it is every bit as vile as that sounds. It manifests in different ways for people, Basically, it means horrendously painful digestive system. For me, it was like having Bali belly, but I didn't go to Bali and I didn't have the nice holiday. So it was
diarrhea, upset, like vomiting, or just
not
more
vomiting,
the other end?
just
cramping.
diarrhea, really cramping, couldn't really digest much food. It just didn't work.
Totally unrelated to the endometriosis. So you had inflamed reproductive organs, areas, and inflamed bowel. So pretty much everything below the boobs was a mess.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's not fun.
So you were still only around 20 at this time.
I was 19 when I had the operations, and I was 19 when I was diagnosed with Crohn's, and I turned 20, 3 or 4 months after that.
Would it go through phases where it would be worse and then you'd have a few months where it wouldn't be so bad, or was one either the endo or the Crohn's?
Look, there definitely were phases where things were worse, but when I was diagnosed with endometriosis and Crohn's, I was living in Brisbane at the time and I was studying. I did a business law degree, a double degree, and my business degree was in communications because I did have it in my head that I sort of might want to be a journalist. But I ended up doing law and business, and that was a 6-year course, and I did that degree. And I suppose while I was at uni, in some ways, my health was easier to manage because obviously when you're at uni, even though I had a fairly full schedule, I wasn't working 9 to 5. You're not sort of expected to be in an office from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. Monday to Friday. So it wasn't as difficult for me to fit in all of the various medical appointments that I had and to fit in
Trips to the bathroom
and, for the most part. So I was able to function. I didn't feel well, but I was able to function without sort of anything drastically going wrong. So then when I graduated from uni, I moved down to Sydney and I moved into a house with a group of girls who had also studied in Brisbane with me, and we kind of moved to Sydney for our first jobs. And when I started at the law firm in Sydney, that is when my health, particularly the Crohn's, got worse than it ever had. And that was when it became much more difficult for me to manage on a daily basis. So in the couple of months before I had the vertigo attack where I sort of started to fall apart, my tummy was worse than it had ever been. And I was in a situation where I felt more trapped than I'd ever been because there wasn't an easy out. I hated having to take sick days because it felt like in that sort of high performance environment, no one took a sick day. I mean, you basically needed a sick note if you came to work at 9:30. Let alone didn't come. And so there were times when I did actually have to spend days in hospital because my tummy was misbehaving so badly, and I would actually feel more guilty about not being at work than I felt horrendous about physically what was happening with me. And so, those for the last few months that I was working in the firm where every day the walk to work was sort of like this torturous obstacle course, that was probably as bad as things got.
Until the vertigo hit.
Yeah. I was standing up talking to a friend one night. He'd come into my office and it was about 7 o'clock, which was early in sort of that law firm to be even thinking about leaving work. It certainly wasn't on my agenda. And as I was sort of chatting to him, I fell over and it felt like an earthquake had hit, but it turned out I was the only person that had hit. So it was a vertigo attack, which I'd never had before, but I just instantly lost balance and then felt really unsteady and quite woozy on my feet. And so I was the friend that was in with me, he quickly ran and got another one of our friends and they sort of brought me some water and I sat on the ground for a while and sort of to regroup and I just felt terrible. So they took me downstairs and put me into a taxi and I was renting a tiny, tiny apartment at the time with my boyfriend. It was only about a 10-minute taxi drive home, so I went straight home and Nick wasn't there that night. He was down in Canberra. So I just went straight to bed and sort of hoped that in the morning I would wake up and feel completely better and that this awful dizziness would have gone away. But I woke up and it didn't.
You couldn't find an answer for why you had the vertigo.
Yeah.
And you eventually had to quit your job.
Yeah. So when the first vertigo hit, as I said, I went home and I went to bed and just thought, God, I hope this feels better in the morning. And I woke up and I didn't feel better. I felt like I had this horrendous hangover. I sort of got up and I tried to have a shower and I remember it quite vividly. I had to hold on to the tiles in the shower because I was so unsteady on my feet. And I had this headache and I felt nauseous. And I kept thinking, no, it'll be okay. Just have a shower. You can get dressed and you can go to work. And I actually did put work clothes on and then I just realised I couldn't do it. And so I called the office and said I won't be in today. And I went in, I called my GP and my normal GP wasn't there, but I got the first appointment with someone that I could. And I said to her what had happened. But I didn't say to her, oh, by the way, you probably can see in my records, I've got a history of Crohn's disease and it's been horrendous of late and I'm actually feeling stressed and more on edge than I've ever felt in my whole life. I didn't say anything about that. I just said, this is so strange. I had a vertigo attack last night at work and I have no idea why, and now I feel dreadful. Could you please help me?
Why weren't you honest?
Well, I think partly I was in denial because I didn't really want to say how bad things were, but also because I have this ridiculous desire for people to like me, and I didn't want her to think that I was a whinger and say I'm actually not coping. So it actually wasn't a conscious thought process. If this is me, in hindsight thinking, why didn't I say to her how I felt? And I've often wondered, if that had been my regular GP who sort of did know more about what was happening with the response might have been different. But she was very good on the basis of the information that I gave her. She said to me, look, I think it'll probably go away, but why don't we get a CT scan just to be certain that there's nothing wrong, and I'm going to do you a referral to an ENT because if in a week it's still not better.
Ear, nose and throat specialist.
An ear, nose and throat specialist.
Because they thought it might be something with your inner ear.
Yes, because generally that is the most common explanation for if a person has vertigo. So I said, okay, that sounds great. So I went and I got the CT scan that afternoon, and then I went home and sort of spent the day in bed trying to relax. And then I think I actually did go back to work the next day, and it wasn't as pronounced. I could walk, but I didn't feel good. I felt dizzy. I sort of felt like I was seasick in a way, like I was on a boat. Nothing was quite steady. So basically got to the week and I still had this dizziness, and I'd made the appointment to go and see the ear, nose and throat specialist. And when I went and saw him, he just sort of said to me, it sounds to me like this might be a stress-related vertigo migraine. So we see those quite a bit. And he said, spending a lot of time in front of a computer it's not ideal for that circumstance. And, you're working in a busy law firm. I know what that environment's like. I think you probably need a week off to sort of regroup. And my heart sank when he said that, because I was like, oh, God, I have to take more time off work. Only person in the whole of Sydney who can't work because they're sick. This was the internal talk I had. But I realised that that's probably what I had to do. So I got back to the office and I spoke to my boss, and my boss in that rotation was a lovely, lovely guy, and he was completely supportive. So I booked flights and I went home for a week, and I was mad about pursuing relaxation. It was like, I need to relax. I can't be stressed about anything. But I was so stressed because I had nothing to do, and I felt so guilty that I had nothing to do. So mum and dad, both of my parents work, and they still do work. So they would go off to work in the morning, and I was like, right, have breakfast with them, and then it was like, time to de-stress, time to relax. Nothing that I did helped. It actually I ended up, I finished the week in a worse state than I began because I was so desperate to de-stress myself. But actually the problem is things were so far gone that I was never going to be able to, on my own devices, somehow unwind this horrendous position I was in.
And you couldn't go back to work at the end of that week, could you?
Well, I flew back to Sydney. I tried, but it just wasn't working. And ultimately Mum and Dad said to me, why don't you come home? I think we just need to get you better. And I didn't resign from the law firm, but I said to them, I just need to take unpaid leave and get myself better.
How did that make you feel, having to do that? I can guess.
Well, yeah, I felt shame, and I felt like I was letting them down. Trust me, I was not letting them down. The firm was going to cope perfectly well without my tiny contribution, but I was thinking, what sort of a graduate does this? These jobs are hard to get and you're just walking away and so lazy. But I also knew at that point that I had persisted for a really long time with subpar health, but this dizziness was new, and I actually couldn't get through the days pretending that I was okay because I wasn't.
It's so interesting reading through how you tell this story and listening to you now. There's the track of your physical health, which was going down and down and down, and you were trying to treat this with various medical appointments, seeing different experts. But then it was pulling your mental health down with it. And for someone who had always been a high achiever, a perfectionist, can't let anyone see my weak spots or my vulnerability, wanting everyone to like me, the effect of those two things together, you kind of can say, well, it was only ever going to end one way. with total breakdown, which is what happened when you got back to Lismore, but it took a few more months, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. That was difficult because I had been to boarding school, not because my parents hated me, but because we lived in a regional area. Both my parents grew up in country New South Wales and they both went to boarding school, so it was sort of just what we did. But because of that, I'd never lived at home as an adult. So there was nothing about me being back at home that was normal. I couldn't sort of pretend that there was anything about this situation of me being at home.
And you were 24.
Yeah, I was 24 at this point, and Nick and I had moved in together in that January.
How long had you guys been together?
We had been together 2.5 years when this hit. But so we'd been together 2 years when we moved in together.
And he was studying medicine at the time and also playing professional rugby.
Yes.
And so he was obviously familiar with your health problems and the toll. I want to ask you about the toll that took on your relationship, first of all, because even before you had to go home, what was it like having you, him and your illnesses in the same relationship?
One of the sort of fortunate, well, I mean, it's sad that this is fortunate, but because he was studying medicine, I think him having a degree of medical knowledge and an interest in medical knowledge meant that when he and I first met and he heard about my broad medical diagnosis, I mean, I wouldn't blame anyone for wanting to run 100 miles an hour away. But he, even from the very beginning, was quite fascinated, and he's a very gentle, empathetic person. So his response was, wow, you've got a lot going on. You know, this is a big thing. How do you cope? How do you manage? And he approached that with a lot of sort of kindness and genuine interest. So that was probably a good starting point for that. You know, I think that because we were together, it's like that frog in boiling water situation. I think when I was getting worse and worse, he obviously knew that I was getting worse and worse, but also he was with me every day and I wasn't saying to him, by the way, I'm absolutely 100% not coping, because I wasn't actually admitting that even to myself. And so, I was, despite not being well, I was working, full-time in a pretty intensive job, and he was studying medicine full-time and he was playing rugby between Sydney and Canberra. And so there was sort of a busyness to our lives that meant we weren't sort of home every night together, debriefing over how did your day go, and I'd say, oh, well, let me tell you about the start of my day.
So a lot of it he didn't know about?
No, he knew that I wasn't well. And, he and my mum and my dad, actually, and a couple of my best friends, there were definitely people that were on the sidelines saying, is everything okay? Have you, people knew that things weren't right, and Nick certainly was in that camp, but he wasn't able to get a particularly good response from me about what I might do about that.
In Lismore at home, your mum took leave from her job to take care of you because you needed pretty much full-time care, which must have been incredibly tough on you, but also on her. She then, her mental health started to struggle because you would lash out at her often. You explained the devolution, I guess, of your mental health and your outlook on life and your self-esteem, and it all just starts to collapse in on itself as you go from expert to expert, hoping that this medical appointment will be the answer, this medical appointment will be the answer. And at the time, it's the vertigo that you really want the answer to. If at all possible, can you identify the lowest point during those few months that you were at home?
I think the lowest point was one time, I think I'd been home for about 3 months, and Nick had come up. So he was sort of coming up when he could, and we were talking every day, but he would come up for a night or two when he could between study and rugby. And he came up, and one night he sort of said to me, why don't we go for a little walk just down to the end of the street? And that was something that Mum had sort of been trying to do with me, and I didn't appreciate when she suggested that we do that. I didn't really appreciate any suggestions that she made, which is probably why it was really difficult for her own mental health, because she was watching her daughter unravel, but her daughter was also being quite mean to her. But this particular night, Nick said to me, why don't we go for a walk? And I was really excited about that because it was just something so small, but I was like, yes, let's go for a walk. So we sort of held hands and went for a little walk. I'm talking not even 300 metres down the road. And I had sort of one of the big vertigo spells. So I had this general dizziness all the time, but then occasionally I would have, like that night at work when it first started, have this big sort of shoot of vertigo where I'd kind of lose balance. And that happened, and I lay on the ground and I just wouldn't get up. Nick was desperately trying to help me and trying to carry me, and I just lay there and I wouldn't respond to him. And I didn't want my life to be over at all, but I just wanted this to be over, because at this stage I had spent 3 months at Mum and Dad's place, basically either on the couch or in my bed, miserable. And also, can I just say, this was before Netflix. Okay, so that wasn't even like you had streaming services to distract you for the day. There was nothing.
And with vertigo, you probably couldn't read, or
I couldn't read, and it was before podcasts. It was before podcasts. There was a lot of. I was in this dark place where I genuinely didn't think I was ever going to be able to have an existence beyond my parents' couch. And I absolutely adore my parents. I love them to pieces, but I did not want the sort of extent of my whole life to be on the couch.
So you're just watching your whole future fall away, and your identity as well.
Yeah, I did. And I was it just was absolutely terrifying. And I was also, at that point, I was so embarrassed of what it had come to. Do you know, because I knew, I could hear the panic in Nick's voice, and I knew how much he just wanted me to get up, and I knew how much he wanted to make this all better, and I just couldn't respond, and I knew how difficult that was, and it was horrible. And, eventually it was probably about half an hour later that I kind of just relented, and I let him kind of pick me up and hobble home. And that, because the other thing was we hadn't taken our phones with us or anything, so he couldn't sort of call. Even we weren't very far from Mum and Dad's house, but we didn't. There was nothing we could do, and that was definitely the lowest point.
You learnt a term when you were going from medical professional to medical professional, which was a heart sinker. Someone told you were a real heart sinker. What does that mean in the context?
So the doctor who said that to me basically rolled his eyes and said, "Oh, you're a heart sinker. Heart sinkers are the patients. We see their names on our list and we just think, oh, God, not them." And he sort of said it in the way that, because I wasn't responding amazingly well to the particular drugs that he'd put me on for Crohn's, and that was sort of quite frustrating to him.
Because doctors like to fix people.
They do like to fix people. And the thing is, Nick was actually with me for that appointment, and Nick was at that point, I think he was a final year medical student, and we left and he was just like, you just don't ever say that to the patient, even if you think that. Why would you say that? And, it was not a particularly sensitive remark from a doctor, but to someone like me, it was really problematic because it just sort of emphasised this narrative in my head that if I was a good patient, I wouldn't have any problems because the medication would fix me and whatever they prescribed would work. And in my case, I had those 3 operations for endometriosis and it didn't fix the problems. I was diagnosed with Crohn's and I was put on all sorts of different medications for different times, and some improved things but nothing made it better. And then with this vertigo, I was never a good patient because nothing ever worked.
So you even felt like you were disappointing doctors, all of your doctors.
Yeah.
There was another doctor who said to you, you seem like you just would be better at the cappuccino lifestyle.
Yeah.
What did he mean by that?
So this was particularly brutal because when I first had the vertigo attack, and actually at the very first GP appointment that I went to the next day, the GP said to me, "Dodd, there actually is a guy in Sydney. He's amazing at dizziness. He's a neurologist, and he's amazing. So if it was really bad, you'd probably want to go in and see him." And his name sort of got mentioned a few times by different specialists, but also by, we'd sort of put the word out to all of our family friends, all the extended family. Does anyone know anything that could maybe help?
He was considered the guru.
He was. And I had him as my sort of, I was like, he is the one that will save me. I just know it. He will. But he was really hard to get an appointment with. The only way you could get an appointment was you fax your referral from your GP and then they will fax an appointment back to the GP. There's no discussion about time.
Remember faxes?
Yeah, I know. But even back then, faxes were quite outdated because we were certainly in the world of email being a pretty, ubiquitous tool. So even that was strange. And anyway, so we got given the appointment, and at the time I got the referral and got the appointment, it was about 4 months away. And so
you'd been holding on with every iota of hope that
yes.
that the guru would be able to fix you, and instead he said
he basically looked through my files and, I mean, I did do some testing while I was there. He has some apparently phenomenal dizziness testing. So I went through all of this stuff. But he said to me, look, I mean, I just think if we're honest, Georgie, you strike me as something as like a cappuccino girl. I just think, you know, you're not cut out for a tough life.
Meaning you just want to like hang out in coffee shops.
Yeah, and drink cappuccinos.
Not work. So he couldn't have got you more wrong.
Well, no, I don't think I mean, I actually do like cappuccinos, to be fair.
I'm not being literal.
No, I know. No, I know you're not. And this was literally the point where I had been at home for nearly 4 months. I had not worked. I had not done anything. I was certainly feeling like maybe I am not cut. I didn't even think maybe I was cut out for cappuccinos because I was barely fit for public consumption at this point. You
told Nick to leave you and go find someone else, didn't you?
Yeah, I told him that a lot because I really did believe that I was never, ever going to be able to rejoin, you know, life.
I found that part interesting when I was reading that because I thought to myself, if I didn't know how this story ended, Nick's a pretty extraordinary person to stand by you. I don't mean that
yes.
It's just like this could have been forever. It certainly was looking that way. And I don't mean that Nick could have been forgiven for going, see you later, I'm out of here. He's obviously made of much stronger stuff. But things were so terrible and had been so terrible between you for so long. There hadn't been much of the Georgie he fell in love with evident to him for such a long time. And that is one of the big challenges of being with someone who has a chronic illness, right, is staying connected, which he did to his enormous credit and yours, to the person inside you that was still there, that was still Georgie.
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple of factors there. Nick is probably the most optimistic person that you would ever meet. You know, he wakes up every day and is thrilled with, you know, I mean, sometimes it actually annoys me how positive he is about everything in life because he can have a bowl of Wheat Bix and be like, oh, how good are Wheat Bix? Wheat Bix are so good.
Sounds like ScoMo.
Okay, sorry, wrong. Absolutely nothing like ScoMo.
How good are Wheat Bix?
No.
And also democracy.
Oh, okay, yep, different to Scott Morrison, but is just wired in a way that
he's a glass half full guy.
He is a glass half full guy, and he just, I don't know. We met when we were young. You know, we were 22. We were both 22 when we met, and there was something. You know, our relationship, obviously we've been through a lot and we also on a daily basis can drive each other absolutely mental, and it's not as if we have some fairy tale married or relationship. We don't. But when we met, it was just, I don't know how to describe it, but there was no question that we weren't going to do life together. You know, it felt like we'd found the missing piece.
Yeah.
And not in a way that, I mean, I think the thing we've always found is that he feels like I make him better and I feel like he makes me better. And not that I need fixing and not that he needs fixing, but it's like I support his dreams and ambitions every single day and he does the same to me. And it was, I think for him, he did, and probably maybe because he was so busy and had a lot going on in his life, but he was really able to have perspective that I didn't, which was this will pass.
Yes.
You know, and I wasn't able to have that perspective. And I think because of that, I did try to convince him a lot. And I did get very close one time. He had one day, a full day, and he still remembers it as being one of the most painful things that he's experienced. But he just was like, would I make it easier for her to recover if she's not feeling guilty about letting me down? Fortunately, he decided he would overrule me on that one. And I just didn't have it in me to fight anymore.
Good move, Nick.
Good move.
And you know what? If you had cancer, he wouldn't have left you.
No, he wouldn't have. But the thing is, I mean, obviously,
and you wouldn't have left him.
No, and that is absolutely true. We did have we were committed to each other, but at the same time, we were young, and I think because I didn't know what was going to happen, I just sort of thought this is probably the nicest man that's ever lived on the planet. He deserves to have a fun girlfriend, someone who is actually fun and kind and funny to be with, not an invalid.
how did the decision come that you needed to go into formal care? And what do you call it? A mental institution?
Well, it's rehab. It's a psychiatric hospital. Effectively, I went to a private psychiatric hospital. I don't want the word private there to give anybody the impression that it is a luxurious facility.
It
absolutely
wasn't the
not.
Priory.
No, it was not. And I also did feel quite ripped off that I was going to rehab and I didn't even have like some fabulous drug addiction.
It was interesting you called it rehab through the book, and I thought, and you explained that there were two wings. There were the people who were there for addictions, and then there were the people there who were there for mental health.
Yeah.
Why rehab? I suppose you were recovering from.
Yeah, well, it is effectively
a mental breakdown.
It's a rehabilitation program that you do as an inpatient in a hospital. So the huge, big turning point in my falling apart came one afternoon when Mum took me to a physician in Lismore, and he said, "Georgie, I'm so sorry for what you're going through." And when he said that, it nearly made me cry because it was the kindest thing and most sincere thing a doctor had ever said to me. And he said, look, in my medical experience, I've been treating patients for nearly 50 years. Whenever there are unexplained physical symptoms, stress is always the explanation. And he said to me, look, what I would recommend is that you see a psychiatrist tomorrow morning, and I think you probably need to start medication, but I'll obviously leave that to psychiatrist, and I would think you probably need some rehab, so I would be looking at an inpatient facility for you. And I felt sort of shocked but also relieved. I was really shocked that 4 months ago, or a bit over 4 months earlier, if someone had said to me, we're going to admit you to a psychiatric hospital, I would have been mortified, and I just couldn't have envisaged that. But as soon as he said it, I realised that he was right, because that would be an explanation for what was happening.
How do you prepare to go to a psych hospital?
I was actually quite excited about it because I thought, this is something, I'm trying something, it might make me better. But the car trip up there was horrendous. I thought I was going to vomit the whole time, and I got Dad to pull over about 5 times, and I was dry retching. I was so scared about it. I don't know what I thought.
That must have been so hard for your parents.
Yeah.
To deliver you in that state.
I know.
And then drive away.
Yeah. And then it didn't get immediately better when we arrived at the psychiatric hospital, and it was just the saddest looking building you've ever seen. It's sort of just like a brick box, and we were all, in our family, we all have quite a good sense of humour, and generally we can reach for something, but there was nothing, and not even Dad, who is always trying to make us laugh. There was just nothing.
Did it feel like a hospital?
Yeah, it looks like a hospital. If you drove past it, you would think, is that a retirement home or is that a hospital maybe? It just is literally a brick box.
And are you locked away?
Well, it is locked, yeah. It is locked, but you are allowed to go out for walks with a guide. So you're not like handcuffed or anything, but you are locked in. You can't leave.
What kind of people were there with you?
So when we parked and then we went inside, and it's in Currumbin in the Gold Coast, and it's sort of, so there's some greenery about. That was the only sort of not wholly depressing thing about the picture. So there were some trees and stuff on either side, and we went inside, and it was basically peak hour of people being checked in. And so there was a whole host of different people of different ages, and there's people that are being checked into the mood disorder wing, which is what I was doing, and then there's people in the drug and alcohol wing. And there was a full spectrum of ages, and there were a lot of really, really sad-looking people, like really sad, because it was pretty obvious in most cases who the patient was, but equally the people that were with them admitting them looked just as shattered, because obviously I don't think anyone necessarily arrives. It's not like I don't know if people dream about getting to rehab as like a destination, to be honest.
Like dropping someone off at daycare or
no, and it's not like a holiday that you're sort of feeling really excited about. So it was a pretty sad looking room. But then saying goodbye to Mum and Dad was really hard, but I also just kind of felt like this is an opportunity, this is something. And I'd had nothing. I'd had nothing to hope for that might help me. And this was, I really did think at this point I had come to grips with the fact that I did have some issues, mental health issues. I had spent so much time thinking that we had to get my physical health sorted, and then once that was done, my mental health would recover. But the truth is, I'd just reached a point where I realised that even if my physical health was never going to be recovered, I had to start looking after my mental.
Because they were so entwined.
Yeah, but I don't think I even realised at that point how entwined they were, but I just knew that I could not function anymore with this sort of level of – I was very depressed at that point, but I was just in a bad way. So saying goodbye to mum and dad was hard, but I also did just feel this weird sense of I think this is where I need to be. And so then I got back to my room and, it's funny how these little bits of, fate happen. But the woman that I was sharing a room with was in her early 50s and she had been diagnosed with breast cancer 2 years earlier. And through the chemo and radiation, she had actually had – her physical health had really deteriorated. She had basically had this horrendous digestive system and she couldn't get on top of it, and then basically everything just fell apart. And so it was strangely similar to my story. She was really lovely and she had 2 adult daughters who were probably around my age. They had admitted her. But Sue just felt safe, and there was certainly a lot of other people in there who I would not have related to in the way that I could with Sue. It felt like she didn't feel like my mum, but I felt safe in her presence, and I felt like from her story I could see the parallels between mine, and I could see that she had all this guilt about having had these illnesses and the burden that had put on her family, and then sort of this guilt about not coping with the physical symptoms. And when I was listening to her, I was like, you need to give yourself a break. Of course, you didn't want breast cancer. You've done the best that you can. Your family didn't choose, And then suddenly, though, I was thinking about my own situation. I was like, well, I didn't choose Crohn's disease. I didn't hope for this. It's not my fault that this is something in my life that employers or my parents or my boyfriend has to put up with. It's just what it is. I think meeting Sue really set a good tone for me there because I felt like I had a little friend.
How long did you spend in rehab?
I was there for 2.5 weeks.
And you were busy every day.
Yeah.
There was a lot to do. You even went to an NA meeting.
I did go to Narcotics Anonymous because
it was on the schedule.
It was on the schedule. I loved having something to do. And I think probably because I did go to boarding school, I am slightly institutionalised. So for me, this environment of group meals and here's your schedule and this is happening at this time. And it's all very much, most of it is voluntary. So basically when you get there, you have a GP, a psychiatrist, a psychologist that you see regularly, and they're the same people. So you might not see them every day, but they're the same people that you see every couple of days. And then there's social workers, and there's a whole lot of other therapists and psychologists that run different sessions. So there's a map basically of what you can do. And the only things that are compulsory are your medical appointments. So you have to see the GP, the psychiatrist and the psychologist at your allotted time. Everything else you can choose. But because it was all in sort of one building and I could wear my pajamas, it was quite comfortable, I just went to everything and I found it all fascinating, like literally all of it fascinating. And the group therapy sessions I found amazingly interesting because of the perspective that it gave. And, listening to other people talk about their struggles with mental health and what they were feeling about it, everybody who was struggling in there had this added layer of punishment and guilt because they had this problem. And when I was listening to people say that, I realised I was doing the same thing and it just isn't necessary.
I guess there must be some context in there too, isn't there? Because when you were at home, you were the only sick person surrounded by healthy people physically and mentally. But when you were in rehab, everyone was the same or worse than you.
Yeah.
So suddenly you didn't feel so abnormal. I imagine you felt seen and
yeah, definitely. And
understood.
you have a different perspective there than you do when you're sort of, and as I said, because for me being at home, it was just, it was also foreign and I wasn't meant to be there. Do you know, it wasn't like of my choosing.
So rehab was almost in a boarding school context more familiar to you than being at home with your parents as an adult.
I think also just having things to do, and I found it fascinating. I mean, I am a very curious person, and so I found it fascinating going to every session that's why I went to everything on dysfunctional family relationships.
It's also a distraction, which when you suffer from anxiety, which you were diagnosed with pretty early on in your stay at rehab and put on medication, distraction is a very powerful way to treat anxiety.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. When I think back to that week I took off when I first had the vertigo to relax, I had no chance to relax because I had nothing to do.
If you've got anxiety, that's the worst thing you can do is just take away all stimulation and force yourself to relax.
Yeah, it was a nightmare. Whereas at rehab, I sort of had this framework and it was all very safe. I felt like there's doctors here. If something happens to me, I'm going to be taken care of. And I felt like I had some purpose. I could go along to sessions and...
You had a job which was getting better.
Yeah.
What happened when you got out?
So I did start medication in there and I remain on medication today and my dose has never changed. I'm very lucky in that the one I was put on worked for me and I've stayed on it. When I left rehab, I came back to mum and dad's for another sort of week or two, I think. I resigned from the law firm and after a few weeks, got a job at David Jones selling clothes. So it was all very gently returning to life. But I was seeing a psychologist in Sydney who the clinic at Currumbin had sort of teed up so that I would come back to Sydney and sort of start doing that straight away. So I just sort of created this really strange but amazing life where I worked a couple of shifts a week. I looked after myself. I had really become quite fond of very gentle exercise while I'd been in rehab. And I just kind of rebuilt my health and loved being able to live again.
10 years later, you're the mother of 3 little girls. You and Nick are married. He's a surgeon.
In training.
You're a journalist. You're on television all the time. You're now an author. How's your health?
Well, my health is always a work in progress. But, the funny thing is my life now, but also particularly, when I think about since we've had kids, our life has actually been more stressful, far more stressful than my life was when I had a nervous breakdown. Back then there really just was me to take care of, but I fell apart because I had unchecked anxiety and I sort of got into this toxic cycle or a vicious cycle. But, my life is definitely a lot more stressful now, but I'm able to manage it. And I think it's because I've had anxiety. I treat it. I still take medication. I still see psychologists regularly when I know things are flaring up. But I think it's because I sort of was forced to lay the foundations for living where I actually prioritise my well-being. And I'm not at all like a woo-woo kind of person
No, you're not.
at all. But after I had the breakdown, I really did. And basically what I did after rehab was kind of just lay some foundations for good mental health and good well-being. And I think because of that, I've kind of been able to be resilient and cope and not have a nervous breakdown, even when life has actually been, in genuine terms, far more stressful.
Why did you write the book?
The very first time I wrote about my nervous breakdown, I sent it to you. You knew it was me, but we published it. You published it anonymously on Mamamia. And that was about 2 years after I had recovered. And Nick and I had moved over to England at that point. He was doing his master's over there. And I didn't really have anything to do, which was another challenge because no one would employ me. And I sort of thought, right, I'm just going to do a bit of writing because I'd always loved writing. And I'd actually, before we'd left Sydney, I had been working as a journalist for about 18 months at PRW magazine. Writing was something I loved doing, and I just sat down and I wrote what had happened to me. And I sent it to you and you published it. And I still remember there were about 200 comments on that story within a few days. And this was in the really early stages. Mamamia was just you, I think you and maybe Lana, maybe 2 people. And I felt so sort of heartened by that response because so many people could relate to it.
They said me too.
Yeah, a lot of people said me too. And I think at the time when I fell apart, I really did think no one had ever been through anything like what I went through, which sounds very egotistical, but just I was trapped with no perspective and I just really felt like no one else has gone through this before. And it was so lonely, really, really lonely. And I think that every time since then, because I do some public speaking now, and whenever I speak about it, whenever I've written anything about it, it always gets a positive response. And so a couple of years ago I was approached by a publisher and sort of was asked if I wanted to write a book, and I said that I would, and this seemed to be the natural choice because I think a lot of people will relate to my experience. I think what happened to me was quite extreme. I don't think everyone will be admitted to a psychiatric hospital necessarily for rehab, but I think that living with sort of frantic stress or living with compromised health or being a perfectionist and being really unkind to yourself, I think all of those themes are very real issues for a lot of people. And I think it's easy to sort of think, oh, well, that's okay, that's just the way I am. That's how I used to think. Everyone used to say to me, just stress less. You don't need to worry so much. And I just was like, well, what a ridiculous thing to say. How could I?
Don't have blue eyes.
Yeah, how could I ever do that? But then because I was forced to sort of go through what I did do, I realised it actually is possible to make choices about how you think and how you respond to situations. And I didn't realise you could change that. But also it wasn't until I tuned into that and realised how mean I was to myself that then I realised why I had to change it.
When I had my nervous breakdown, I went back to that story that you wrote and that I published because I also didn't think I knew anyone who had suffered from anxiety, let alone had a nervous breakdown. And I was pretty close to being hospitalised. I think I probably should have been. But I was on holiday at the time and I think I didn't have access to my regular GP. But I remember looking up your story and feeling relieved that I could see an example of someone else that I knew who had been to hell and come back and got through it. So thank you for writing it all the way back then before I even knew I needed it. And for all those people who've heard you talk about it and who've read the stories you've written and who can now read your book, you've done a great thing. You've done a really, really great thing. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for publishing that very first piece because I think it did give me confidence that I really needed at that point, but also, yeah, it really did tell me that this was a story that is of use, that would connect with people.
Ugh. How delightful is Georgie Dent? She really does light up any room with her warmth. I asked her if Nick would have a chat to me as part of this podcast. I met him on a number of occasions at barbecues, and he is as delightful as Georgie, but he is, unlike her, very shy in front of a microphone. So I didn't have any luck persuading him to come and chat. But in the end, I think that Georgie's story was just so beautifully and wonderfully told by her. And in the book, she talks a lot about Nick and the role that he played and how their relationship got through such a difficult time for her. It's really, really a story about love and family as much as it is about mental health. If you want to buy Georgie's book, and please do, it's called Breaking Badly. It's got a red cover with a lot of black sort of scribbles on it, which I thought was such a great way to portray anxiety and what it's like to be inside your head when you're having a nervous breakdown. My nervous breakdown looked a little bit different to Georgie's, but I could relate to so much of what she said and so much of what she wrote. You can find Breaking Badly in any good bookstore. And if you're after something else to listen to, may I suggest my interview with Dr. Jodie Lowinger. She's an anxiety doctor. She's an expert. And the podcast is called Anxiety, A Guide. As I said, it dropped a few weeks ago and you can find it in your No Filter feed. We have had a massive reaction to that podcast. A lot of people listening, a lot of people sending it to friends, relatives, either who have anxiety or who they want to help understand more about what it's like for them and what it's like to be inside an anxious mind. No Filter is produced by Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman and I'll see you on Mamma Mia.